passionate about books for as long as I can remember. Novels, poems, plays and stories have always been an essential part of my life. As I read the classics, I started to become curious about the authors behind the books. Why had they written these novels or plays or poems? What of their own experience had gone into their works of literature? Now I'm trying some virtual talks. Come with me on an exciting journey into the life and works of one of the great writers of English literature. Let me take you into the wonderful world of Jane Austen's fiction with a scene from her most famous novel, Pride and Prejudice. Mrs. Bennet would not give her husband time to reply, but hurrying instantly to her husband, called out as she entered the library, "Oh, Mr. Bennet, you are wanted immediately. We are all in an uproar. You must come and make Lizzie marry Mr. Collins, for she vows she will not have him, and if you do not make haste he will change his mind and not have her." Mr. Bennet raised his eyes from his book as she entered, and fixed them on her face with a calm unconcern which was not in the least altered by her communication. "I have not the pleasure of understanding you," said he, when she had finished her speech. "Of what are you talking?" "Of Mr. Collins and Lizzie. Lizzie declares she will not have Mr. Collins, and Mr. Collins begins to say that he will not have Lizzie." "And what am I to do on the occasion? It seems a hopeless business." "Speak to Lizzie about it yourself. Tell her that you insist upon her marrying him." "Let her be called down. She shall hear my opinion." Mrs. Bennet rang the bell, and Miss Elizabeth was summoned to the library. "Come here, child," cried her father as she appeared. "I have sent for you on an affair of importance. I understand that Mr. Collins has made you an offer of marriage. Is it true?" Elizabeth replied that it was. "Very well, and this offer of marriage you have refused?" "I have, sir." "Very well, we now come to the point. Your mother insists upon your accepting it. Is not it so, Mrs. Bennet?" "Yes, or I will never see her again." "An unhappy alternative is before you, Elizabeth. From this day you must be a stranger to one of your parents. Your mother will never see you again if you do not marry Mr. Collins, and I will never see you again if you do." That wonderful scene was written over 200 years ago, when Jane Austen sat down to write a novel that at that time she called First Impressions. We of course know it as Pride and Prejudice. She struggled amazingly to get that novel published, and she had to rework it. She put it aside for quite some time, but of course that novel has made history in so many ways. Pride and Prejudice has been voted the most romantic novel ever written. It has also been voted the world's favourite novel, and the scene in which Colin Firth, acting Mr. Darcy, plunges into a pond and emerges from it in a wet white shirt has been voted the favourite television moment of all time. So Jane Austen, I think, would be amazed to know that the novels that she wrote about 200 years ago have been making history in this way, and that they're still loved, prequelled, sequelled, adapted, dealt with in so many different ways all over the world today. So let me tell you something about this woman who penned these 6 truly marvellous novels. Jane Austen was born in the tiny little village of Steventon in Hampshire in the south of England in the year 1775. Her father, George Austen, was a clergyman of the village of Steventon and the nearby village of Dean. He and his wife Cassandra had 8 children, all of whom, amazingly for that era, lived to become adults. But the Reverend George Austen did not have a great deal of money. A little bit of money came in from the 2 parishes where he was clergyman. He opened his home to young boys that he tutored, teaching them Latin and Greek and preparing them for the universities, so he made a little bit of money that way as well. And he also farmed the local glebe lands around the church. But Jane Austen grew up knowing that her father would never be able to provide her with a very generous dowry, if indeed any dowry at all, which would of course help to tempt some man to marry her. So when she writes in her novels of being a single woman of small fortune, she does so very feelingly and from her direct experience. The Austens seem to have been loving parents, and they encouraged their children to learn and read books and to do well. First of all, there was James Austen. James followed his father into the church. He married twice. His first wife died very young, leaving him with a small daughter. And he would eventually take over the living of Steventon when his father decided to retire. James was the member of the family who rather fancied himself as an author, and as a young man at Oxford he published a sort of newspaper called The Loiterer, full of interesting articles. He wrote poems, and I think he was the one who really fancied he was the author of the family. Today, of course, James Austen is only remembered for his writings because he was the older brother of Jane Austen. There was a brother called George, and we have no picture of George, and we know very little about him. He seems to have been born disabled in some way. Possibly he suffered from epileptic fits. Possibly he was deaf. There's a little indication that Jane Austen learned some sign language. But he was sent off to live in the country with a farming family who took care of him, and we know very little about the life and personality of George Austen. Then there was Jane's very lucky brother, Edward Austen. Now, Edward, as a young teenager, was actually adopted by some wealthy, remote relatives of the Austens. They found they were unable to have their own children. They took a liking to young Edward Austen, and he eventually took on their surname. He became Edward Austen Knight, and he ended up inheriting their two magnificent properties, one in Kent and one in Hampshire. So he continued to keep a lot of close contact with his own Austen family, and Jane would go and stay with Edward. And I think it was there, in his grand Kentish home of Godmersham Park, that she experienced the wealthier style of life than she was used to at home in the parsonage. There she could drink French wine upon which duty had to be paid, instead of the homemade gooseberry or rhubarb wine in the parsonage. And of course this experience would prove invaluable to her when she came to create the very grand houses of her fiction, houses such as Mansfield Park, Pemberley, Rosings, and other grand homes. So Edward's position in life was really a fortunate one in terms of his sister's experience that she gained there. But you do wonder how the Austen siblings must have felt that one out of their number was sort of plucked out, given these marvellous opportunities. Edward went off on the grand tour of Europe. His own father could never have afforded that for him, and given the chance to be a landed gentleman with plenty of money. There was Henry Austen, who was Jane's favourite brother. And Henry would eventually move to London, and Jane Austen would go and stay with him in London when she was seeing her novels through the press. And Henry acted as her business manager. This was an era when women were not really supposed to have direct business dealings with men like publishers, and so Henry would take on that job for his sister. But Henry had something of a checkered career. He ended up going into the army. He then became a banker, but his bank unfortunately went bankrupt in the last year or so of his sister Jane's life, and then eventually Henry too became a clergyman. After Edward come the naval brothers, Francis and Charles, and both these boys ended up leaving home when they were very young, going off to the Royal Naval Academy in Portsmouth, and beginning what became eventually dangerous but also very successful careers in the Royal Navy. For much of Jane Austen's lifetime, her country was at war with France, and this meant that the Royal Navy was very important indeed in protecting English shores from the forces of Napoleon. Jane, of course, celebrates the profession of her naval brothers in her novels Mansfield Park and Persuasion, and she thought very highly indeed of the Navy, and one gets a sense of that in characters such as the wonderful Captain Wentworth in her novel Persuasion. Jane Austen had one sister, her older sister Cassandra. She and Cassandra were absolutely devoted to each other. In fact, Mrs. Austen at one stage said that if Cassandra were going to have her head chopped off, then young Jane would wish to share her sister's fate. Most of the letters that we have written by Jane Austen, which have survived, were letters written to Cassandra when one or other of them was away visiting. Sadly, Cassandra did have a bonfire before she herself died and destroyed many of Jane's letters. We don't know what was in those letters. Was it bitchy comments about the relations? Was it remarks about love affairs that had gone wrong? We'll just never know what was in all of those letters that Cassandra destroyed, but I think every biographer has really regretted that bonfire. We don't have really good pictures of Cassandra. We've only got a silhouette of Jane's beloved sister. And we don't have satisfactory portraits of Jane Austen herself either. We've got one picture done by Cassandra Austen of her sister, and this was considered not particularly like Jane by the nieces and nephews of the family. Cassandra was not a great artist, but this tiny little portrait is today in the National Portrait Gallery in London, and it is the only really authentic portrait that we have of Jane Austen. After Jane Austen died, one of her nephews decided to write a memoir about his famous aunt, and he asked amongst the family and wanted a portrait of his aunt that he could include in the book, and Cassandra's little sketch of her sister was produced. But the nephew wasn't very happy with this picture. He felt it made Jane Austen look just a little bit too grumpy, a bit too severe. So what happened was that he paid for an artist to give Jane Austen something of a facelift. So in the portrait that this artist produced, the face looks rounder, softer, there are more sort of feminine curls, a bit more lace and frills. Generally it is a prettied up portrait of Jane Austen. I actually prefer the more severe look. I think Jane Austen could be severe upon her fellow human beings. I think she was very sharp in her wit, so that's the portrait that I prefer. But biographers have generally tended to be about 50-50 when it comes to the use of these two different portraits within their various biographies. The only other portrait that we have of Jane Austen is extremely unsatisfactory. It shows her sitting outside on a nice day with her bonnet strings untied. I always want to call out to this portrait, please would you just turn round and show us what you look like. But sadly, that of course cannot happen. So we're really left with a very sketchy idea of what the greatest novelist of all time actually looked like. Now, Jane Austen had a happy childhood. She writes in her novel Northanger Abbey of the young heroine Catherine Morland rolling down the green slope at the back of the house. One suspects that Jane Austen herself did that with her brothers and her sister. And she was given opportunities to read the books in her father's library. She, of course, learned to sew. That was a very important part of any young lady's education. She learned to play the piano. But she didn't travel. It was in many ways a very confined childhood, but it does seem to have been a happy one. Now, Jane Austen's father taught other young boys Latin and Greek, but education for girls in that era was very different indeed, and Jane Austen's formal education lasted for less than 2 years. She was sent away to the Abbey School in Reading. She also had a little bit of education in Oxford. In fact, she caught a nasty infection and nearly died, so we're very lucky to have the novels at all. But during her time at school, she was taught the sorts of things that were regarded as necessary for young ladies of the gentry class, and those were the things that would fit them for marriage. So Jane Austen would have learned sewing, a bit of household management. She'd have learned dancing because that was an important skill that one used to catch the all-important husband. She did, we believe, learn a little bit of French at school, but she certainly was not studying English literature or any of the sciences or geography or history. Many of those subjects were just not considered important for girls at all. So in many ways, Jane Austen educated herself in her father's library. He had a good collection of books, and he was also, we're very pleased to note, a keen novel reader. And so Jane Austen read the early novels by people like Samuel Richardson and Henry Fielding and various others of the era. And many of her early attempts at writing were really satirical plays on these various novels that she was reading. So she was having a great deal of fun satirising these different works. Now, every young lady of the era was taught how to write a good letter, and many of Jane Austen's early writings were in the form of letters from one character to another. And we're very fortunate to have what is called Jane Austen's juvenilia, the little pieces that she wrote when she was a young girl from about the age of 11 through her teens. And these pieces are absolutely marvellous. So if you've read all 6 of the novels and need some more Jane Austen, try reading her juvenilia. I'd like to read you a little piece from a story that she wrote when she was probably about 14 years of age. It's a little tale called The Three Sisters. Now, when we read Pride and Prejudice, we all love to laugh at Mrs. Bennet and her desperate attempts to find husbands for those 5 daughters. This is a little story in which I think we see early versions of Mrs. Bennet because there's a mother trying very hard to get her daughters married off. And Mrs. Bennet, of course, although she does it in a very misguided way, is actually doing far more to look after the economic futures of her daughters than is her husband, who just goes off into the library and shuts the door. But Jane Austen knows that there's a great deal of comedy to be made from the idea of marriages and young ladies desperate to get married, and that's what you find in this fabulous little story. I'll just read the first letter from this tale. The Three Sisters. My dear Fanny, I am the happiest creature in the world, for I have received an offer of marriage from Mr. Watts. It is the first I have ever had, and I hardly know how to value it enough. How I will triumph over the Duttons! I do not intend to accept it, at least I believe not, but as I am not quite certain, I gave him an equivocal answer and left him. And now, my dear Fanny, I want your advice whether I should accept his offer or not, but that you may be able to judge of his merits and the situation of affairs, I will give you an account of them. He is quite an old man, about 32, very plain, so plain that I cannot bear to look at him. He is extremely disagreeable, and I hate him more than anybody else in the world. He has a large fortune and will make great settlements on me, but then he is very healthy. In short, I do not know what to do. If I refuse him, he as good as told me that he should offer himself to Sophia, and if she refused him, to Georgiana, and I could not bear to have either of them married before me. If I accept him, I know I shall be miserable all the rest of my life, for he is very ill-tempered and peevish, extremely jealous, and so stingy that there is no living in the house with him. He told me he should mention the affair to mamma, but I insisted upon it that he did not, for very likely she would make me marry him, whether I would or no. However, probably he has before now, for he never does anything he is desired to do. I believe I shall have him. It will be such a triumph to be married before Sophie, Georgiana, and the Duttons. And he promised to have a new carriage on the occasion, but we almost quarrelled about the colour, for I insisted upon its being blue spotted with silver, and he declared it should be a plain chocolate. Oh, I won't have him, I declare. He said he should come again tomorrow and take my final answer, so I believe I must get him while I can. I know the Duttons will envy me, and I shall be able to chaperone Sophie and Georgiana to all the winter balls. But then what will be the use of that when very likely he won't let me go myself, for I know he hates dancing, and what he hates himself he has no idea of any other person's liking. Oh, I believe I shan't have him. I would refuse him at once if I were certain that neither of my sisters would accept him, and that if they did not, he would not offer to the Duttons. I cannot run such a risk. So if he will promise to have the carriage ordered as I like, I will have him. If not, he may ride in it by himself for me. I hope you like my determination. I can think of nothing better, and am, yours ever affectionately, Mary Stanhope. I think you can imagine the fun that a teenage Jane Austen had writing little stories like that one, and then reading them aloud to her family in the drawing room after dinner. One assumes that the family laughed in all the right places, and this would have greatly encouraged the young author, for as time went on, she, of course, continued to write. Now, once Jane Austen got to the appropriate age, it was time for her to go out into the social world, to start attending dances, to go off to weekends or holidays at friends' homes, and of course to try and meet that all-important husband. Jane Austen loved dancing, and all of her novels have dance scenes in them, and she was very aware that courting couples could really make the most of time alone on the dance floor. Those chaperones were at the side of the room. A dance in those days often lasted nearly as long as 30 minutes, so it was very important to make the most of this time and to find out whether your partner had bad breath or whether he was extremely boring, to learn whether you might have some sort of compatibility as a couple, and of course to do that all-important flirting. So Jane Austen includes these dance scenes in her novels and makes full use of them. We can picture Darcy and Elizabeth sparring with each other as they make their way along the dance. So Jane Austen herself loved dancing, and she did meet young men, but as I mentioned earlier, she had no dowry to tempt them into marrying her. Her very first surviving letter is to her sister Cassandra, and it mentions a handsome young Irishman who has arrived in the village. His name was Tom Lefroy. It's very hard to know definitely from Jane Austen's letters if she totally fell in love with Tom Lefroy. But what we do know is that he had 5 unmarried sisters back home in Ireland. He was starting his career in the law and was very dependent on a wealthy uncle who was paying the bills. He could not afford to marry a penniless girl from Hampshire, and so after various dances and a bit of flirting going on, he left, and probably Jane Austen never saw him again. Whether her heart was deeply touched, we will never really know. We do know that when she was 27, she did receive a proposal of marriage. This came from a young man called Harris Bigwether, who was the older brother of some good friends of Jane's. The proposal clearly took her by surprise. Harris was younger than she was, he had a bad stammer, he didn't seem to have shown any particular interest in her before this time. And Jane Austen was probably very taken aback, and she said yes to him. She went to bed and probably had very little sleep that night, for when she woke up in the morning, or got up in the morning, she told Harris Bigwether that she was unable to marry him. I think the woman who would go on to create Mr. Darcy, Mr. Knightley, Captain Wentworth, Henry Tilney, some of those wonderful heroes from her novels, just couldn't cope with the idea of marrying a man she was not in love with. I think in many ways posterity can be grateful that Jane Austen did not marry Harris Bigwether. Jane Bigwether doesn't have quite the same ring to it as Jane Austen. Had she married and probably had lots of children, she might have been far too busy looking after her husband's home and bringing up her children. Or, like some of her sisters-in-law, Jane Austen could well have died in childbirth. She had 2 sisters-in-law who died after giving birth to their 11th babies. It was a very perilous thing for women of the Georgian era. So I think we can be pleased that she never married Harris Bigwether. There might have been another flirtation at the seaside with a young clergyman, but we don't even know the man's name. Cassandra commented that he seemed very interested in in Jane Austen, and was planning to come back, and they expected that he would propose, but then they heard that he had died of a fever. So Jane Austen's own love life was in many ways not a satisfactory one, and we have to turn to her novels if we want great love stories. As time went on, Jane Austen's father decided that he was going to retire, and he and his wife moved to Bath. Now, they took with them their two unmarried daughters. Cassandra had been engaged to a young clergyman. He had died on a voyage out to the Indies, and so Cassandra had decided that she would remain a spinster. So the Austens took their two unmarried daughters with them to Bath because neither of these girls had an income of their own. They were financially dependent on their parents. Cassandra had a tiny amount of money left to her by her fiancé, but it was certainly not enough to set her up in her own establishment. So Jane moved with her parents to Bath, and her time in Bath does not seem to have been a particularly happy experience for her. After they had been there less than 2 years, her father died suddenly, and with him went some of his income. So the Austen ladies were reduced to a fairly small amount of money. The various brothers helped out as they could, but this was charity, and Jane was very aware that she had no money whatsoever of her own. It was only in her mid-30s, when she finally got her novels published, that she had money she could call her own. She had earned it. She could spend it as she wished. Living in Bath, I think she was very aware of the fact that she didn't have much money, that she was now on the shelf as far as marriage was concerned. But I think she was also very depressed by the fact that her writing career seemed to be going nowhere. Now, by the time Jane Austen moved to Bath, she had written early versions of some of her novels. There was an early version of Northanger Abbey, at that time called Susan. She did manage to sell this to a publisher, and he paid her £10 for her manuscript. But for some reason, and we don't really know why not, the publisher did nothing about bringing out her book. And it was only many years later, when she had anonymously published her first 2 novels, that Jane Austen wrote to this publisher saying, "Please, can you tell me what you're going to do about my book? Because if you don't want to publish it, I'd like to find somebody else who can." And the publisher said to her, "Give me back my £10 and you can have back your manuscript." I would personally like to dig up that publisher and let him know that the woman from whom he demanded back that £10 now features on the £10 English banknote. I think there's a certain justice in the fact that it's the £10 note that now features Jane Austen's image and words. So Northanger Abbey was getting nowhere. She had also written an early version of Sense and Sensibility, called probably Eleanor and Marianne at that time, and she had written an early version of First Impressions, which later became Pride and Prejudice. Her father had actually written off to a publisher in London, asking if the man would be interested in publishing this novel, First Impressions. The publisher never actually read the manuscript. He only saw Mr. Austen's letter, but he wrote back by return of post and said no, he had no interest in this book whatsoever. And so Jane Austen put her manuscript away, and it was only some years later that she reworked it, retitled it, and of course it was then published as Pride and Prejudice. So if at this time in her life, living in Bath, Jane Austen had thought to herself, well, I've tried my best to be an author and I'm not getting anywhere, nobody seems to want my novels, I'd better just give up, I don't think any of us could have blamed her. But fortunately for posterity, that never happened. After Bath, it was Southampton. Jane and her mother and sister went off to live in Southampton for a couple of years, sharing a home with Jane's brother Frank and his new wife Mary. They were all a bit short of money, so it made sense to all share a home and share the various expenses between them. But again, this wasn't a particularly happy time for Jane Austen. She was very aware of her lack of money, that single status, and the fact that she was not yet a published writer. Finally, Jane Austen's wealthy brother Edward came to the rescue of his mother and sisters. He offered them a home in Chawton, where he owned the great Elizabethan manor house of the village. He didn't offer the manor house to his mother and sisters, that was rented out, but he did offer them Chawton Cottage, and this would be Jane Austen's home for the last years of her life. It's called a cottage, but it's got several bedrooms and I think is a rather large cottage by our definition of the word today. But Jane and the other Austen ladies were really delighted to move into this cottage. They didn't have to pay any rent. They were back in rural Hampshire, an area that they loved. James was not too far away, and they could see old friends and relatives. And so in the year 1809, Jane Austen moved into the house at Chawton. Once there, she got out these manuscripts that she had worked on years before, and she obviously thought she would have another go at getting them published. She worked first on Sense and Sensibility. She sent it off to a London publisher, and he replied saying that he would publish her novel, but if he ran to any financial loss over the business, she would have to reimburse him. Now, this was a big decision for a penniless woman to be making. Possibly Jane's brothers urged her and said, "Look, Jane, if you have any problems, we will help you out." And so she went ahead with Sense and Sensibility being published, and that novel came out in the year 1811. Written on the front, or inside the front cover, were the words, "By a Lady." Pride and Prejudice, which followed, had written inside it, "By the author of Sense and Sensibility," and the other novels had, "By the author of Pride and Prejudice." Those magic words, "by Jane Austen," only appeared in the two novels that were published after her death. Jane Austen treasured her anonymity. She didn't want every village busybody to know that she was writing novels and perhaps suspecting that she had put them into her novels. So it was very important to her that others did not know that she was the author of the books. Late in her life, her brother Henry did let out the secret. He was so proud of his sister Jane, he couldn't resist telling people that it was his sister who had written Pride and Prejudice. But Jane was actually rather cross with Henry when he let out the secret. It was important to her to remain anonymous. Fortunately, Sense and Sensibility did not run to any loss. In fact, Jane Austen made about £160 from her novel. It was not a runaway bestseller. Sir Walter Scott, a very important author of that era, was being paid as much as £1,000 for each of his novels, so Jane Austen was certainly not in Scott's league. But who reads Sir Walter Scott now, whereas Jane Austen is still incredibly popular? So Sense and Sensibility's success encouraged her to go back to another one of her manuscripts, rework it, give it a new title, and in the year 1813 the world became a better place in which to live. Pride and Prejudice was out there for people to read. This has always been Jane Austen's most popular novel. It's the one I tend to recommend if people say they've never read an Austen novel. I think they should start with Pride and Prejudice first. Its hero and heroine are wonderfully charming. It's funny. It's got some of her greatest comic creations, such as Mr. Collins, Mr. Bennet. It is a truly timeless and utterly wonderful classic novel. Pride and Prejudice sold reasonably well, but again was not a huge bestseller, and the reviews that it attracted were good ones. But of course, since that time, Pride and Prejudice has just grown and grown in popularity. And when Colin Firth, as Mr. Darcy, stepped out of that pond, the female half of the world went mad. And quite a few men were fairly keen on the scene as well. Gay men absolutely loved it. So Pride and Prejudice is her most popular, her most beloved, her most quoted novel. Jane Austen, after that, began a totally new book, so she had no other old manuscript to rework. She had, during the time in Bath, written a little fragment called The Watsons, but she never completed that. We don't really know why not. She obviously decided it was going nowhere. So she sat down to write a new novel one we know today as Mansfield Park. Mansfield Park is such a rich, magnificent, complex, deep novel. It doesn't tend to be a book you fall madly in love with on a first reading, but it's a book you have to read and reread and reread and reread. And the more you go into Mansfield Park, the more genius you discover within its pages. In Pride and Prejudice, Jane Austen had created her most charming hero and heroine. In Mansfield Park, she gives all the charm to the slightly villainous characters of the novel, Henry and Mary Crawford, whereas Edmund Bertram and Fanny Price are much more difficult characters to fall immediately in love with. But this is another reason to reread the novel, to go back to it, and I think you do become much fonder of the characters the more you go back to it. And as I say, it's a wonderfully complex and incredibly rich work of literature. It's the book that we Janeites most like to argue over. The pro-Fanny, the anti-Fanny, all the different discussions that can take place over this novel give Jane Austen enthusiasts hours and hours of pleasure. The next novel was, in my view, the greatest novel the world has ever known, her book Emma. For me, Emma is perfection. I don't think that one word of this novel could be changed or altered in any way to improve it. I read Emma about once a year. The more I read it, the more I worship this truly wonderful novel. Most critics regard it as her greatest work, and it is generally listed in the greatest 10 books ever written. It is a truly marvellous novel. Emma Woodhouse is so wonderfully human, with all her faults, her little vanities, her meddling in the lives of other people. Mr. Knightley is the greatest hero. He's so admirable as a character, and yet he too is believable with little faults. And there's such a marvellous galaxy of comic characters, from Miss Bates to the Eltons, who we all love to hate, Harriet Smith, so many rich and fantastic characters. People often ask me what it is about Jane Austen's novels that mean that they are still being read, studied and enjoyed 200 years after they were written, whereas writers such as Sir Walter Scott have really rather dropped off the radar today. I think there are several reasons that make Jane Austen still so incredibly readable today. Number one, her books are incredibly funny, and in our current era of dreadful pandemics and wars and disasters around the world, it's really important to find humour and to sometimes sit down and just enjoy a good laugh over something. I think her novels are wonderfully romantic. My daughter was reading Persuasion for the first time many years ago now, and I remember watching from the kitchen as I knew she was getting very close to that fabulous moment when Captain Wentworth writes his love letter to Anne Elliot. She was smiling as she read the letter, and then she put the book down and said to me, "Oh, Mum, I wish a man would write me a love letter like that." I had to tell her not to hold her breath waiting for that one. But it is the greatest love letter in fiction, and the novels are so romantic. Captain Wentworth falling in love with Anne, Mr. Knightley with Emma, Henry Tilney with Catherine Morland, and of course the two sisters in Sense and Sensibility and the various men that they fall in love with. So the novels are true romances, and I think we all enjoy a nice bit of romance in our lives. I think the next reason for still adoring Jane Austen's novels is her perfection with the use of the English language. Every sentence in her books is so well crafted. You never feel that an editor should have gone through with a red pen and deleted or changed. She was a master at using the English language. And in this era of text messages and rather garbled prose, it's a real pleasure to read her beautiful and yet very complex sentences and to appreciate her incredibly great use of our English language. But most of all for me, I think, is the fact that Jane Austen's novels depict human nature so incredibly realistically. and her understanding of what makes people tick is there on every page. I could guarantee that everybody listening to this talk knows a Miss Bates, the character who cannot stop talking. You've all been stuck on the end of a phone with a Miss Bates going on and on and on the telephone. Everyone knows a Mrs. Norris. She's the stingy character from Mansfield Park, the sort of person who always forgets their purse when it's their turn to pay for the drink. We all know Mrs. Norrises. We know sporting bores like John Thorpe in Northanger Abbey. We know party animals like Sir John Middleton of Sense and Sensibility. And we know hypochondriacs like Mary Musgrove and Mr. Woodhouse. Jane Austen's characters are alive and well in our world today. Jane Austen began another novel, and that's her novel Persuasion. But tragically, she did not live to see this novel published, and she may well have gone back and made some changes before publication. Persuasion is her most romantic novel. We all love Anne Elliot. She's a magnificent heroine who's good and moral and gentle, and her emotions are so powerfully felt on every page of Persuasion. But Jane Austen just didn't have the energy to see this book through the press, to go to London and correct the proofs, and so her brother Henry arranged for the book to be published in the year after Jane Austen's death. Before she died, she did start another novel. It's a little fragment of about 12 chapters that we know as Sanditon, and it's a rather odd book for a woman who was dying to have written. It's about a group of characters who go off to the seaside to breathe in the sea air and be dunked in the sea water for their health. And Jane Austen has wonderful comedy in the book over the imagined illnesses of these characters. It does seem a rather unusual subject to have been chosen by a woman whose own health problems were very real indeed. Other writers have had a go at finishing off Sanditon, but of course none of them have done it in the way that Jane Austen herself would have done it. And it would have been so marvellous to see where she was going with that book, what sort of changes she was making, because it does seem in some ways to be slightly different from the novels that came before it. But tragically, Jane Austen's health symptoms were now so severe that she did need to lay down her pen, and apart from letters and a little poem that she wrote just a few days before she died, Jane Austen would write no more fiction. She was taken by her sister Cassandra into the nearby town or city of Winchester. It was hoped that a doctor there would be able to do something to help her. Now, we don't know exactly what Jane Austen died from. It's thought probably something called Addison's disease, a failure of the adrenal glands, but other theories have been put forward: Hodgkin's lymphoma, possibly breast cancer, possibly just plain tuberculosis, and I guess we'll never really know what it was that killed Jane Austen. But we do know that she grew weaker and weaker, staying in a little house not far from the cathedral in Winchester. And in July of the year 1817, when she was only 41 years of age, Jane Austen died in the arms of her beloved sister Cassandra. She was buried in the great cathedral of Winchester, and her grave there is the most visited spot in that cathedral today. Now, Jane Austen herself might have died, and we had no more wonderful novels, but her legacy was living on very powerfully indeed. Late in the Victorian era, her nephew wrote a memoir about his aunt, and this sort of began a trickle of books about Jane Austen. Slowly, critical works about her novels began to appear. And of course now that little trickle of books has become an absolute torrent of books about Jane Austen. There are so many aspects of her life and world that have been covered by different writers. So you can get books on Jane Austen and music, Jane Austen and dance, Jane Austen and food, Jane Austen's gentleman, Jane Austen's irony, Jane Austen's England, Jane Austen's Lyme Regis, Bath, London, and the list goes on and on. I, of course, have added to that list with my books about Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice on its 200th anniversary, my book A Dance with Jane Austen, and my book Jane Austen and Crime, which looks at things like elopements, duelling, poaching, gambling, and even murder in the writings of Jane Austen. I've also written a little memoir, Jane and I, A Tale of Austen Addiction, explaining just how greatly reading Jane Austen has changed and shaped my life. So there's an enormous Jane Austen industry out there today. You can buy Jane Austen merchandise in all sorts of weird and wonderful shapes and forms. And of course, you can join Jane Austen societies, and there are now Jane Austen societies around the world, from Denmark to Argentina, Singapore, Japan, Holland, Italy, and of course in Australia. The Jane Austen Society of Australia meets every 2 months in Sydney, publishes wonderful magazines and journals, holds all sorts of conferences, study days and events, sells interesting pieces of Jane Austen merchandise, and is, in my rather prejudiced view, the very best society in the entire world. So Jane Austen's legacy really lives on in so many interesting ways. There are very frequent new film versions of her novels, sequels, prequels, adaptations, religious versions of her works, pornographic versions of her works, zombie versions of her works, you name it, they are out there. She is considered to be the 3rd most written about woman in the entire world. And that's no mean achievement for a young lady from Hampshire who struggled to get her novels published in the first place. I'd like to end my talk about Jane Austen and her marvellous writings with a scene from my absolute favourite novel, Emma. This comes from near the end of the book, when Mr. Knightley is walking with Emma in the grounds of her home, Hartfield. Emma has been messing around in the love lives of other people, and it looks like she might have made terrible mistakes with her own. She's just come to realise that she's in love with Mr. Knightley, but she thinks he's about to get married to her friend, Harriet Smith. As they've walked, they've been discussing the couple Frank Churchill and Jane Fairfax, who have just recently got engaged. And Mr. Knightley has commented that he envies Frank Churchill. Poor Emma thinks this is the moment when he's going to tell her that he wants to marry her friend Harriet Smith. "You will not ask me what is the point of envy. You are determined, I see, to have no curiosity. You are wise, but I cannot be wise. Emma, I must tell you what you will not ask, though I may wish it unsaid the next moment." "Oh, then don't speak it, don't speak it," she eagerly cried. "Take a little time, consider, do not commit yourself." "Thank you," said he, in an accent of deep mortification, and not another syllable followed. Emma could not bear to give him pain. He was wishing to confide in her, perhaps to consult her, cost her what it would, she would listen. She might assist his resolution or reconcile him to it. She might give just praise to Harriet, or by representing to him his own independence, relieve him from that state of indecision which must be more intolerable than any alternative to such a mind as his. They had reached the house. "You are going in, I suppose?" said he. "No," replied Emma, quite confirmed by the depressed manner in which he still spoke. "I should like to take another turn." And after proceeding a few steps, she added, "I stopped you ungraciously just now, Mr. Knightley, and I am afraid gave you pain. But if you have any wish to speak openly to me as a friend, or to ask my opinion of anything that you may have in contemplation, as a friend, indeed, you may command me. I will hear whatever you like. I will tell you exactly what I think." "As a friend," repeated Mr. Knightley. "Emma, that I fear is a word. No, I have no wish. Stay, yes, why should I hesitate? I have gone too far already for concealment. Emma, I accept your offer, extraordinary as it may seem. I accept it, and refer myself to you as a friend. Tell me then, have I no chance of ever succeeding?" He stopped in his earnestness to look the question, and the expression of his eyes overpowered her. "My dearest Emma," said he, "for dearest you will always be, whatever the event of this hour's conversation. My dearest, most beloved Emma, tell me at once, say no if it is to be said." She could really say nothing. "You are silent," he cried, with great animation, "absolutely silent. At present I ask no more." Emma was almost ready to sink under the agitation of this moment. The dread of being awakened from the happiest dream was perhaps the most prominent feeling. "I cannot make speeches, Emma," he soon resumed, and in a tone of such sincere, decided, intelligible tenderness as was tolerably convincing. "If I loved you less, I might be able to talk about it more. But you know what I am. You hear nothing but truth from me. I have blamed you and lectured you, and you have borne it as no other woman in England would have borne it. Bear with the truths I would tell you now, dearest Emma, as well as you have borne with them. The manner perhaps may have as little to recommend them. God knows I have been a very indifferent lover. But you understand me. Yes, you see, you understand my feelings, and will return them if you can. At present I ask only to hear, once, to hear your voice." While he spoke, Emma's mind was most busy, and with all the wonderful velocity of thought had been able, and yet without losing a word, to catch and comprehend the exact truth of the whole, to see that Harriet's hopes had been entirely groundless, a mistake, a delusion, as complete a delusion as any of her own, that Harriet was nothing, that she was everything herself. Her way was clear, though not quite smooth. She spoke then, on being so entreated. What did she say? Just what she ought, of course. A lady always does.